Welcome everybody to this Peace of Mind show, which we're very happy to have. We have a wonderful guest to talk with, one of my favorite people, in fact, Michael Shank. I'm Rich Rubenstein. I am at least a teacher. I'm a teacher at the Carter School and will be for at least one more year, after which I become emeritus, which is, I think, which is sort of a form of not disappearing while you're actually disappearing. But we were very happy that Michael was able to make this this date today and talk to us, because he has so much to say, and there's so much about him that will be of interest to other students, to potential students, to alums, in fact, just in general, to people in our field. So our guest today is Michael Shank, who is a graduate of the Carter School. In fact, it wasn't quite called the Carter School yet, I think, when you graduated from it. And was a doctoral student with us and did a really quite remarkable dissertation, one of the earliest studies that I know, one of the earlier studies about climate change and conflict. I don't know what, Michael, what your plans are for getting that published or revised and published, but he's been so busy that he probably is not interested right now in doing that. But it certainly was publishable, and it has very important things to say about climate and conflict. It's hard to introduce Michael because he is he's a polymath, he knows lots of things about lots of things. And he's got an amazing variety of skills, skills and talents that have led him in a number of different career directions. And I think you'll be interested to hear about, he's going to talk about that later, but you'll be interested to hear about it. But what I can tell you about Michael is that he is not only comfortable with conflict theory and able to write wonderful works like this dissertation, but he is a practitioner of the first order, but a practitioner in a very broad sense. In fact, when I first came to know Michael, he was already very active in Congress. He was a congressional assistant. He was, I think we were legislative assistant, Michael, to Mike Honda, Congressman Honda from California, and was very familiar with the way Washington politics works and the way congressional politics works. And that continued while he was studying with us. He continued to do some very interesting political jobs and have political connections in Washington, and to use the skills that he has as a conflict resolver and also a pursuer of justice, to do both, to resolve conflicts by helping to create justice, and which really was a guiding principle for his in his work for Congress, but also led him after graduation to do a number of other things. One thing he did was, and he can tell you some of these details later, and you can ask him about him. But one of the things he did was to become the representative of the American Friends Service Committee in Washington on foreign affairs to Congress. He was a lobbyist, right? One of the good lobbyists. I mean, there is such a thing as a good lobbyist, and he was one of them. He also had a series of jobs working with people who, as he was, were interested in doing something about the environmental disasters that are increasingly on our agenda, including climate-related disasters. And he'll be able to tell you something about that, because that work is continuing. Those interests are all continuing. Michael was also at the same time as he was a practitioner, he was also an academic, and he was a wonderful teacher. He taught for us, and one of the things he taught was how students can express themselves in writing so as to get their views known to the public. Michael is one of the great op-ed writers, and he writes op-eds, he's written articles, and articles that are intended to influence policy, and which therefore are difficult to write because they have to be comprehensible to non-academics. So Michael has been able to kind of cross this borderline between the academic and the non-academic and go back and forth in a way which is really quite extraordinary. I mean, we do have some other people who can do that too. I mean, we're very fortunate in how interested our students are in making their ideas work in the world. But Michael is an exceptional talent at doing that. So I'm not going to go on and on and on about him. Just to say that he has, he's one of those people who walks the talk, as they say. While he was living here in the DC area, one of the ways in which he walked the talk was to move over to Anacostia and live there, live with the people of Southeast Washington, and become a community activist. He's a community activist wherever he lives. Also, I think one other thing I should say about Michael is that he manages to be a deeply involved policy wonk, if you want to put it that way. Somebody who wants his life and his work to make an influence in policy, which takes tremendous commitment and energy. He does it all without being a fanatical person, right? He does it all with being an exceptionally well-balanced person who has a personal life as well as a political life, and has spent the last few years living in Vermont, something he can tell you about, a situation which has had its ups and downs for him, the rural life. But he is deeply committed to keeping people healthy by keeping them in touch with nature. And so that's part of his personality as well. So I think I've said enough to intrigue you if you are not already intrigued, if you didn't know him already. And so I want to ask him a few questions, and we will have a relatively short interview, and then we'll open this up so that everybody can talk who wants to talk. Michael, let me ask you as the first question. I'm not sure I ever even asked you this before, but how did you get to us? How did you get to the conflict resolution school, which then became the Carter School?
SCAR at the time, yeah. And
Yes.
Hey everyone, it's really nice to see you all. Thanks for hanging out this afternoon with me for a conversation, and it's nice to see some familiar faces from yesteryear, James. It's good to see you. I remember classes with you, and NJ, it's good to see you as well. Rich, thanks for that introduction. It's very kind of you to say what you said, and I appreciate hearing about me through your eyes and your lens, so that was worth the call right there, just hearing that. How did I get to SCAR at the time, now Carter School? So I grew up Amish Mennonite in small town Ohio, and my father was a Mennonite preacher, and both grandfathers were Mennonite preachers, and all the way back to the first Amish bishop in the US was my sixth great-grandfather. So I come from that clan, and as many of you know, the Mennonites have really built out a whole conflict field of practice and theory. And so my master's was at EMU, Eastern Mennonite University. They have a Center for Justice and Peace Building, which most of you probably know about. And so knowing about GMU and SCAR at the time was easy. Now, why did I get my PhD? I was working in New York for an NGO that was helping the UN think about integrate culture in peace building processes, and realizing that I wanted more, needed more, and wasn't sated with my grad degree and wanted to move to DC and really get into politics. And so twinning both further study, because I do really well in structured learning, and so knowing that I would thrive in a doctorate environment, getting my doctorate, but also wanting to be in DC, be in politics, get into policymaking, it made sense. And of course, one of the founders, as you know, as many of you know, perhaps some of you new to this conversation don't know that ICAR, SCAR, and Carter School, I guess it was CAR, ICAR, SCAR, now Carter School, was indeed one of the founders of the field, and especially the higher education pursuit of the field. So was excited to take some of my arts and culture background, because that was my undergrad, and move it into the conflict field and explore that. So my application to the Carter School was intended to further deep dive into the arts and culture and the role of arts and culture in peace building. And I didn't end up pursuing that. That clearly wasn't my dissertation, as Rich noted, because I really ended up focusing on climate. But that's how I got in, and I think that's probably why they accepted me, because they're like, oh, this is interesting. Here's a guy who has some background in arts and culture and its role in peace building processes, and yes, let's integrate that. Now, I still think about it, care about it, but that's not my day-to-day anymore. But I knew about the school, wanted to be in DC, and I say all that because these are some real assets, as you know, and the time I spent in DC with the Carter School and even working for the Carter School, it was all about building a bridge to policymakers. So when I think about the Carter School and why I keep teaching at the Carter School in an adjunct capacity is because I desperately want our experts in all the ways to be influential and impactful in policymaking decisions within the federal administration, within Congress. And I know some of you are probably very involved in that already. And I just see so much more work we can do to influence and impact policymaking. So there's real asset in being so close to DC, and that's what attracted me.
Good. Well, thank you, Michael. So once you got here, I think people might like to know what did the school do to you or for you? How did I don't mind if you say how it hurt as well as how it helped, but what was the influence on you? Yeah.
Well, I have only good things to say about the school. I had very positive interaction in all my classes with all my teachers, most of my teachers. And no, I thoroughly enjoyed the engagement. And, in every program, my undergrad program, my master's program, my PhD program, there will be, and I see some of you are probably existing students here, there is a concern like, oh, I'm not getting what I thought I'd get. And I really think that dynamic is potentially present in all programs, and it's really how you apply yourself and seek out what you want. And that's what I've always done. I've always initiated and created and tilled new ground. And so I got what I wanted out of the program and ended up working there because I was so interested in building that bridge between conflict theory, policy and practice, and federal policy. So I clearly was keen to continue working with the Carter School because I was so engaged already. I think it's the one place in DC. Now, this is changing slightly because you're seeing other schools build out program in this space. But it was the one program that really constantly deep dove into basic human needs and what underlies conflict and the root cause of conflict. And that's so missing in most conversations. And I wasn't keen to do traditional IR, international relations, because they don't have as their quest the unearthing of root cause for a lot of these conflicts. And I found that the professors at the Carter School were genuinely interested, authentically interested in exploring that, giving theory to it, and building out a set of professionals who are committed to doing that in their respective positions, private, public sector, Defense Department, State Department, Congress, you name it. And so I have really fond memories and experiences at the Carter School. I was also, for folks who don't know, I've been on the advisory board, which is a kind of in a peripheral way, peripheral capacity, but that also is a testament, I think, to how much I care about the school and what we're creating, what we're trying to bring to the world. And I think there's so much more potential that we could pursue in terms of professionalizing the work we do and taking lessons learned from the case study, from the ground. I'm putting that in quotes because what is the ground and what is the field? And bringing it to bear and making sure that we're as influential and impactful as possible. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth in that space. But my experience was very positive. If I'm frustrated, the one thing I'd be frustrated with is that as I would knock on professors' doors, and Rich knows as well because I've always appreciated his writing and his work to be influential in the public space, in the media, but I always wanted professors to do more. And if there was ever a frustration, I think some of the professors were like, okay, Michael, stop knocking down our doors. We're not ready to do what you're asking us to do, or it just wasn't within their purview. So I ask that of everyone I work with ever. Hey, do you want to share your voice with this outlet or this venue or this medium or this channel? And so professors probably got tired of that.
So, Michael, thank you for that. Those are really interesting comments. But say a little bit, if you would, especially since we've got a lot of students here, say a little bit about how you managed your life as a student, but also an activist.
But a student as also an activist?
An activist. And, I mean, one of the, when you talk about people's frustrations at a school like ours, one of the frustrations is that a lot of people are interested in practice. And sometimes they're not feeling they're not getting enough practice, opportunities and that, that kind of thing. And we've been kind of struggling to integrate theory and practice better ever since I remember coming here. But you seem to be doing a lot of stuff, all of this stuff at the same time. And how did you do that?
That's a great question. And to be fair to my colleagues who studied with me, who did have families, who did have full-time partners that they were married to, I did not have those competing interests. So to be fair to them, what I'm about to say was in my singular capacity. But I did get my PhD while working full-time, so it took longer. But what I liked about that is that I could take those couple years of classes and test them in real time in the real world. And I value that. My master's, I took a year off to do my master's, but strongly recommend anyone who's thinking about their master's or PhD not to take this significant block of time outside the work environment. Now, I recognize some people have to do that. And so I recognize for especially study abroad, they're not able to work. And so they can't get that integration. But I found the integration vital to what I learned in the classroom and then what I tested in real time. Now, short of working and schooling full time, there are other ways to kind of test theory in real time practice, because there's your local environment, there's your state environment or provincial environment or regional environment where you can test that stuff constantly. And something I've done ever since I moved to DC is thought leadership to problem solve publicly. And this, not everyone feels comfortable doing this, because if I look at my writing, not always did I get it right, and not always was it a finished product. It was a thought process. So if I look at my writing, I consider it more a trajectory of thinking and problem solving. And hopefully in aggregate, the collection is considerable and thoughtful. And you see my evolution of thought over time too. So in terms of practice, I think we as students and as individuals can bring a lot of that practice to the table. You mentioned Anacostia. So when I was in Anacostia, yes, super involved as a community activist, because that was the environment in which I was living, and I had to be. And there's no other way to really live locally, I think, unless you're engaged. Otherwise, you're divorced from your neighborhood. I've always been close to my neighbors and very involved locally, even here in Vermont. I think that's vital for testing the theory. And so I recognize not everyone can school and work at the same time, but I actually think that's the way to do it, because you're getting both.
When you were doing both of those things at the same time, was it mainly working with Congress you were doing? What were you doing?
Yes, so that's correct. That most of my writing, of my research and writing, was in Congress. Prior to that, I think my schooling, my classes, I was working for a nonprofit that doesn't exist anymore in DC that was focused on foreign policy. So it was either nonprofit or Congress.
Yeah. So, and just for people's information, so we found ourselves, we originally moved from Fairfax to Washington to be closer to Washington. Right, Fairfax to Arlington to be closer to Washington and the urban problems, but also the federal government and its problems and opportunities. And then many of us found we were using Michael the way we were going to get close to the federal government. And Michael was there; he was in Congress, and so it opened doors for us. So interesting the way that works sometimes. The students lead. Well, when you're finished with the dissertation now and you defend the dissertation, now you're a doc. What was it like to move from the school environment totally out of it? I mean, I understand it wasn't as much of a shock to you as it is to some people, if you're totally in the academic environment and then totally, not. But even so, it must have been in some ways difficult.
Well, for anyone who's working on their dissertation, Rich and Solon and Ed Mayback would just encourage me to get it done, because at some point it is really just about getting it done. So crossing that finish line and the huge relief that comes from it. I think, Rich, what I miss, and I know you and I have talked about this too, is creating a permanent or ongoing or sustainable community of theory and practice that engages and critically thinks and challenges and problem solves together. So if I miss anything from school, from that container, it's that. Yes, I have some of that in Vermont. Yes, if I move back to DC, my community in Congress and the administration is still there, and so I can re-immerse into that community that challenges and thinks critically. But I have such allegiance to Carter School because I know, for the most part, this community approaches the world similarly, and there's real value in that. Like, I love my adjunct teaching because I know the students, some of whom are on this call, who have taken my class, when they're coming to the table, generally, they're approaching the world with similar lenses. And that's really exciting to me. And, if I could recreate anything, it's that container where we're taking the day's events, we're fitting them into our theoretical conversations and unpacking them. And then we're problem solving them, not just in the classroom or in the container, but publicly as well, because we really need to be out and about constantly.
Yeah, and we share that vision of a community that extends beyond the school, it extends into the world, but that very actively involves alumni and friends. And so many of the good things that we've done involve that community. It involves our faculty and our students, but it involves other people as well. So I was thinking of you the other day because a student asked me some question about the ladder of success.
They wanted you to bequeath to them the ladder, or like, how does the ladder work?
It's sort of like, how did you get this cushy job, as a professor? I mean, how do you do that? And when I started thinking about my own career, the ladder is the last metaphor I would use. It's totally inappropriate.
Same, yeah. Not for me.
I don't know what's a better metaphor: psychedelic trip or accident followed by another accident.
For me, it's a maze. Yeah, this complex maze, circuitous maze.
It would be fun if you could talk a little bit about your career since. I mean, the way you've been developing your interest and your job interest and so forth.
Yeah. So I know Rich and I have talked about this. Sometimes I feel insecure being in the social science space, and I don't know if others feel the same. I'm not a hard scientist. I'm not an engineer, technical engineer. I'm not a medical doctor, and I feel insecurity about that throughout life. And what reassures me that I'm on the right track is that the world doesn't get along, and still doesn't get along. We're very technologically advanced. In the climate space, we don't need more technical solutions, actually. We need to change behavior. We know what the solutions are, and we just need to build the public and political will for it. But we know the solutions. We don't need more technical approaches to it. So social science is needed, clearly. Our work is needed, clearly. America is unraveling quickly and becoming more violent and vitriolic, and so our work is needed, and then globally too, of course. So as I think about my work and how I built my circuitous maze of who I am, it's been two skill sets that have served me well over time. One is communications, and one is conflict. Now, I wasn't always skillful at conflict management or conflict transformation or conflict resolution personally. I grew up in a Mennonite community that, though we built out a whole field of practice, we're generally conflict avoiders. And so Mennonites are conflict avoiders. So I grew up in conflict avoidance. But then with my master's and with my PhD and with real life practice and serving in assignments in different cultures and contexts and countries, I learned. And hopefully I'm better than I was. I still have a lot of room to grow and learn, clearly. But if I look back at my successes and why I was hired and why they kept me, it's because of those two skill sets, my communications internally and my conflict skills internally. Yes, externally, my CV performed, but it's really the internal stuff. People who were let go, people who didn't stick around, were people who didn't have those two skill sets really fully fleshed out. And so, yes, if you look at my CV and my website, a lot of foreign policy work in the first 10 years of my career, a lot of climate policy work in the second 10 years of my career so far. But it's really the communications skill set and the conflict skill set that has helped me navigate the professional world and work with people who deal with conflict very differently. So basically what we learned in the classroom has really helped me professionally. And so when I teach at NYU, I teach a class on sustainable development. Yes, we do a deep dive into classic sustainable development and the SDGs at the UN, Sustainable Development Goals. But then it's also a lot about how we present that work in the world and how we live it too, in terms of walking the talk. And I could count for you the many times in which I've been kept on staff when organizations have shifted or transitioned or smart-sized, downsized. And I was kept around, I think, solely for the reason that I knew how to engage with boss X, Y, or Z or colleague X, Y, or Z. And for the most part, those two skill sets have really served me professionally. I'll just add one thing on the communications front. So learning how to be a better communicator and listener, and as a boss says to me, X, Y, or Z, reflecting back and all that. But also when I moved to DC, and some of you know this, I knew very well that if I wanted to have power and influence and impact in DC, I didn't have Ivy League. I'm a no-name Shank from a Mennonite community, not an Ivy League kid, or a recognizable name. And I didn't have money, and I'm getting my PhD at a state school versus Georgetown or whatever. So opening doors is not as easy as it might be if I had all those things. And so I just committed then. In 2006, I started writing and writing and writing and writing and writing and publishing and publishing and publishing so that people would listen to me, so that people would take my thought leadership seriously and that I could have influence and impact. And I started taking risks and traveling to places that were risky for a tall white American to travel to, and writing from there for US audiences and really building power that way. So again, for those of us in the social science space, I really strongly think professionally, in terms of professional development, and any student I have, and Andrew would know this, any student I have, I'm thinking constantly about how to improve and enhance, leverage their communication and conflict skill sets so that they navigate the professional world as seamlessly and laterally as they can.
Yeah, I know it's interesting, Michael. When I listen to you talk about that, and you categorize this as communication skills and conflict resolution skills, or conflict analysis skills. But there's also, when I think about what you've done, there's a kind of third there's a third something going on there too, which is you haven't been afraid to, in fact, you've enjoyed rather than been afraid going out and making these contacts, networking with people and doing it in a way which is, you're not saying, give me a job, but it's creating relationships that lead to creative work. And I think it's something very hard to teach if people aren't kind of naturally, I don't know, inclined to do it. I don't know. What do you think?
One of my assignments at NYU is a project assignment where they have to approach an organization. It can be a business or an NGO, nonprofit. And they have to pitch them on an idea that relates to the assignment for class, but it incentivizes the student to go out and do the cold calling, cold outreach, cold email, and improve those skills. And I have so many examples of when I reached out to people I didn't know at the time, like Noam Chomsky or Jeff Sachs, and basically pitched them on engagement. And they said yes, and that led to lifelong relationship and work product. But it was a pitch about co-creation, like what can we create together? And even Rich, when I was at SCAR, I remember ghostwriting for, maybe it was you, or maybe, I forget who all it was, but ghostwriting for a professor or two and member of Congress. And then I eventually took the risk and said to the member of Congress, hey, can I co-author with you? And the first member of Congress to say yes was a Republican from Eastern Shore, Maryland, Roscoe Bartlett. Lisa Wright worked for him, and she said, sure, we can do that. So I co-author with Roscoe. And then that led to a whole bunch of additional co-authors because my credibility was established in that initial co-author with Congressman Bartlett, and then Congressman Gilchrist and a bunch of folks continued to co-author. So yeah, it is, and I get, I'm mindful of that which created the confidence to do that cold calling. A couple of mom and dad raised me that way, but I'm also a tall white dude with a big head who gets called on more quickly as a kid in class. So I'm mindful of all the bias and privilege that went into creating the confidence to do it. And so I'm so committed as a teacher to helping the students that work with me to do the same and feel comfortable and confident doing the same, because we need more conflict experts like folks on this call doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's wonderfully well put. And it's something, somewhere down the line, we have to, on the faculty of the school, we have to talk about how to help people develop what are actually turn out to be in some ways traditional American skills, selling themselves.
That's right. That's right.
So I think I'm about finished with the questions I wanted to ask you. I want to ask you one more, and then let's turn it over to the folks to ask what they want or say what they want. And that is, you've always been interested in making this a better world, or you wouldn't have come to the school to begin with. And I just wonder, how do you define that now? That is, or put it a little differently, have your ideas about what's needed to make a better world changed?
Yes. So the reason why I first focused on foreign policy in the first 10 years of my career is because, as a Mennonite, someone who grew up in the peace and justice community, who wears this shirt every chance he can, and I have like 10 of these, so they're clean, but I wear them all the time because in terms of walking the talk in all the ways, in terms of what we eat, what we wear, what we drive, what we don't drive, how we live, how we heat our house, all of that I think is really important because we are messaging devices, so why not walk the talk? And we know how social norming works, so why not influence our community to do so similarly? But back then, war was the big injustice, and it still is, of course, but as I got more and more involved in the climate work, in the climate space, climate quickly became the bigger threat facing society and humanity, and the work needed to save lives was really in the climate space versus the foreign policy space. Of course, nuclear war could kill a bunch of people quickly, so there's that. But in my dissertation, I was choosing actually, do I go down the terrorism route or do I go down the climate route? And I chose climate because that, in my mind, was the bigger agenda that was facing humanity at the time. Now, how do I have hope? Because a lot of younger generation folks ask me that question, because when you know what you know in the climate space, it's pretty intimidating and intense, or in war. I mean, any of the conflicts that we work in can be very intimidating. So it's key for me to find fuel in nature to keep my spirits alive and well. And the conflict that I mentioned at the beginning of this call with a previous armed neighbor has taken away some of my energy, and I have to rebuild it. I have to be very conscious about rebuilding that energy so that I have hope for the future. When friends tell me that they're having lots of kids, it is an interesting conversation, because if we don't move quickly off fossil fuels, we face a very frightening future. And so the idea of having kids now, I don't have kids, but if I were to have kids now, like, I would want to be on the front lines of making sure we get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, because just even the fires in the Southwest right now are frightening. And so there is this perpetual, not anxiety, but push to do everything I can while I'm here. And I think what compels me in that way, my dad died when I was very young. That's a story some of you have heard. And I had heart surgery when I was very young. That's a story some of you may have heard too. And it forced me to really live day to day and do everything I can to make a difference. And that's my motivation. Nature fuels me to continue that work. I have to be surrounded by people who are also doing good work, because this is hard work for all of us. So having a peer system and peer support is really critical. But yeah, we're at a tricky time in our history, in humanity, and we need everyone we can. I think that's why I'm compelled to teach as much as I am, just because I work full time for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. So I work for full time for cities who are decarbonizing their grids, but I teach on the side because I'm just so keen to get more folks out there and help them do the work that we need done ASAP.
Well, Michael, thank you. I hardly need to say that with students like you, that's one of the reasons I haven't wanted to retire earlier. But
That's great.
so let's open this up to everybody. Anybody would like to chime in and make a comment, ask a question, express an opinion, whatever. Your time. All you have to do is unmute yourself and shoot, or put your hand up. That's right. We have the hand raising thing, which is useful. So Angie, can you hear?
Yes.
There we go.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah,
Thanks,
good.
Richard.
Sure.
And it's good to see you too, Dr. Shank, and thanks
Good to see you.
for the advice that you've been giving well now in this lecture, and also during the class that I took with you. You talked about wanting to inform the theory from practice and bridge the gap between the two. And I wonder, I come from a practical background. I know I'm not working, so I'm just doing academic work. And one of the things I keep thinking about is, how can I inform theory from practice while I am not currently in the field? I think I'm struggling by not being on the front line somehow, because my experience is not being updated. So is there a way where I could do that? And even for people who just have academic background, how do they inform the theory, maybe?
Yeah, so this dialogue that ideally happens between theory and practice, and having taken my class, Angie, you know that was very practically focused, like how do we impact policy and practice in the world, and how do we engage the world in that space. One thing that always frustrated me with preachers in the church, having grown up in the church, is when they wouldn't make the Bible, because I grew up Christian, when they wouldn't make the Bible relevant to the world, and they would just pull some scripture and that's it, and then extrapolate on the scripture, but not make it relevant to the day-to-day, to that day, to June 15, 2022. And in my mind, it was such a lost opportunity to build a bridge for people so that they took the scripture and made it make sense in the world around them, and vice versa, that you're bringing in your lived experience, of course you are, that Sunday morning for Christians. And what an opportunity for dialogue. And it was usually a monologue. And my undergrad was in political theater, working with Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, which was a companion to Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And for those of you who know Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's very much a pedagogy of co-creation. And it's not a bank deposit model. We're creating together. And what I liked about Theater of the Oppressed is that it modeled that. It took theater into the community and co-created answers to everyday problems. And so when I think about a classroom that hasn't yet built that day-to-day bridge to the world around, I think it's just a missed opportunity. And so, you know, if I'm ever working with students who are solely in school, that's why a lot of my assignments are oriented around integrating into public and policy circles immediately, like in class, so that they're building that bridge on their own. And I think they like it. Initially, it gets them out of their comfort zone because school can be isolating, and especially if you get into that routine of classes which are only really in the classroom and not integrated or experiential or immersive, it's easy to get lazy both as teacher and student in that space. And the really active interaction is that dialogue where we're creating something real every time and new every time. And it takes more work every time, but it's more valuable, I think. So yeah, in terms of your specific story, happy to chat later too. And I know you and Rich are having conversations about this as well. And as you think about your preferred space, which is practical, and having participated with you in some of your work for my class, I think there's a lot that could be done, even if you're in the academic space for a while, that will give you the fuel you need because it's rooted in our reality.
Further questions, comments?
David.
Dr. Shank, let me ask a question with a little bit of a preface. Rotary International has begun to devote an increasing amount of its energy and focus to environmental matters, which became an area of focus last year, one of 7, and also to peace in all its manifestations, including the international one. And within Rotary, there is increasing pressure to get much more aggressive in this direction. And in that context, we need more expertise from centers like the Carter School. The question is, have you ever had any engagement with Rotarians? And after you answer it, I'll suggest what we do next.
So I have, through the Carter School, on the ground to some extent, but not formally, the Mennonites have a similar kind of global service-oriented organization called Mennonite Central Committee, which you know, of course. And I love the idea, and I'm familiar with how you're helping build a bridge between the Rotarians and Carter School. And I love the idea of anything we can do to boost that partnership and build out that partnership, because the service-oriented ethic there, I think, brings a lot of value to Carter School. And as I think about Carter's assets for influence and impact and thought leadership, it is the existing student body, but also the alum that are now back in country X, Y, or Z doing the good work. And how do we tap into that network for leveraging our power and our influence and our insight in the political capitals, wherever they may be, so that we can really affect change in a concerted way? I know everyone's doing their good work individually, and that's important, but I'm also thinking like mobilizing, campaigning resources when conflicts are emerging for great effect in different capitals. And I think more can be done there, and I think partnering with Rotarians would be a great boost in that space.
That's excellent. Let me look at your TV website. Let me send you a little bit of background. I just came from the DC Rotary Club, where today was the 30th anniversary of Trees for the Capitol. Rotarians planting trees with the Park Service. And this is literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trees. Other Rotarians who were there, some of whom Rich knows or knows of, are going to be doing this on a massive scale. Tree planting in the Philippines, mangrove projects worldwide. And this, again, is just the tip of the iceberg.
I love it.
But again, great to meet you, and to be continued.
Great to meet you, David. And I'll just quickly add, the service ethic and service model, which again, I was raised in. And so I'm very committed to, gets at basic human needs, which underlies a lot of our conflict work too. So I think it's very complementary.
Is your email address on the website?
I don't believe it is, but it's very simply, I'll just type it in here.
Good, David. Thank you. Nice to see you. Right. Who else would like to chime in?
Let me unmute here.
Go
I
ahead.
guess,
Jim. Hello, Jim.
morning, Rich. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Jim,
Michael,
great to see you.
we haven't crossed paths in quite a long
I
time,
know. It's great to see
but
you.
I've heard, noise popping up from different places that you show up and you're behind it somehow. So anyway, I think I ought to jump on the bandwagon here in terms of this mutual cooperation and engagements. And I'm at a point right now in my, I guess, so-called retirement or post-retirement, where I've written a book based on reflections from my experiences in academic and conceptual work for a good number of years in conflict zones. That's, I worked most of my years overseas with the UN and other organizations. And now I've compiled that into the book. The hardback came out in November.
Tell him the title, Jim. The title. Plug the book.
Analytic Reflections from Conflict Zones and a cautionary tale for polarizing America and the world.
Oh, right. It's
And,
it's a really interesting.
That part 2 is important. Yeah, I can see
Yeah,
why
yeah.
finish there.
I've been reading it. It's very
Yeah, in
interesting.
academia or in school, it was just extra credit for everything that came after the colon, but now it's a much more meaningful contribution.
Congrats on the book.
I was just told this morning that the paperback version came out today,
All right.
and the publisher is Cambridge Scholars Publishing out of England, and they've been an excellent publisher and very helpful in helping get this to a worldwide network of distributors and such. And what I'm doing right now, and I waited for the paperback to come out so that it could be an affordable book for the general public. My intent has been all along to get my perspectives and frameworks and models back to the field, post aged out in that field work, and also to get to the general public, to help push a different perspective, a broader perspective in terms of the dysfunctional national discourse, or to put it another way, the human discourse, which is essentially similar dysfunctionalities around the world these days. Things are coming to a head. And fundamentally, the idea that I'm seeing that it's more, or that it's much of an impulse to strike out and to engage a kind of a rage, a reaction, and as opposed to an impulse to try to solve problems. And that broader perspective is what I'd like to push to engage communities with, organizations, universities, veterans clubs or veterans associations and that kind of thing. I'm a veteran, and I think it's timely, and any ideas that anyone has about who I might be able to engage in that regard, organizations or networks, individuals, and helpful suggestions anyone might have, Michael included, about how to go about that. The time is nigh, and I'm now in a position to do that. Starting out probably smaller engagements, venues, and then moving towards broader, higher capacity audiences as time goes on. So
That's great.
for those who might have some thoughts on that. My email is jadams_400@hotmail.com. And I have an author website that I cooked up. And it's the address for that is analyticreflections.org, O-R-G. So far, I'm the only member of the org, so, but that might change.
All right, thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
I hope you get that message out, and I hope there's a good discussion of it. Anybody else like to get in at this point? Yes, who's got a hand there? It's hard for me to see.
Is it
Rob.
Rob, Mary Jo?
Rob. Hi, Rob. Rob, you're muted if you.
I've got on mute first.
All right.
Well, yeah, thanks for this, Michael. I think we may have been in the same cohort, but I was also working full time. So, we didn't have time to socialize. But this is quite interesting. And it's so interesting that you come from a Mennonite background and you did your dissertation on climate change and, it's et cetera. And you're back to where you were, I think, in a way. But here's my question. When I ask my undergraduates, what is the worst conflict or the most important conflict that we face? And they say, well, what do you mean, like worldwide? And I say, yeah, worldwide. They go, climate change. Over and over, I get that.
Yeah.
So I'd like to appeal to you to get back into that in some way.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I didn't talk much about, here, let me just bring up the website really quick. In terms of appealing to me, that's my day job. So I just put the organizational link. I've been working for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance for the last five years. I didn't really talk about that because it didn't come up in conversation in terms of the questions. But so my day job is helping cities around the world get off fossil fuels. So transition their buildings, their transport to renewables, et cetera, but also really helping them build the public and political will for this work, because it's a big lift. If you think of cities like New York City, their biggest carbon footprint are their buildings, and transitioning their buildings off of oil and gas to electrify them and get heat pumps in there. That's a Herculean lift. It requires a lot of private sector will too. So yeah, it is the youth get it, like the younger generation gets it. They know that this is the big lift going forward as a society, that we need to get off fossil fuels. So I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Yeah,
and then another related thing, we have a course on the books in the catalog about environmental conflict. So, there's a lot of other things besides that climate change, but climate change, of course, causes this, and there's some other problem.
Yeah,
and it might lead to war. But that's right. But I guess the point, it hasn't been taught for quite some time, and I was wondering if you know of any does anybody teach that kind of thing in the academic world, environmental conflict?
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with Frank Dukes when he taught it at the Carter School, and I know we're hiring for this at the Carter School too. I know that hiring process has started. And the Frank Dukes focus, environmental conflict then, was really kind of local management over resource-related conflicts, which is helpful from a climate perspective, because climate change will create more of these local conflicts, these fights over resources. So, both the meta, the macro, is as important as this micro. Like, how do we share resources? And we're already seeing wars over resources globally. We know that to be true. So yeah, thankfully, Carter School is scaling up our assets in that space, because we will see more and more conflicts year after year caused by climate change. No question.
Excellent. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
And I appreciate what you do.
Thank you, Rob. I mean, as usual, the academic world is way behind. It's playing catch-up ball when, there's a climate problem,
right?
And we don't.
Wait a minute.
Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, Rich, I need to inform you that you were my first professor. I was working for Peace Corps, and I was working in the small island states. And my dissertation was on climate change. And it was not something that people were paying attention to. So it went right under the radar. And it's so interesting. So I'm kind of your senior, obviously, Michael. But trying to get attention to this issue was across the United States really a challenge. And making the links to everything that has to do with communication. My undergraduate is liberal arts. My master's is in linguistics, and that was a new one for the school at the time, but it's communication and negotiations, etc. But so I really needed to let you know that there were a few of us who were seriously concerned about power asymmetry and issues that had to do with small island states, the US negotiations, multilateral negotiations. So, and I was going to work full time as well. So everything that you said, Michael, really resonates for me. And what I think would be interesting to hear, especially for students, is when you wrote your dissertation, what kind of theories did you apply to your analysis of climate as a conflict? And then how has that, amplified your impact and your understanding as you continue in this area professionally? So could you talk a little bit about, how you were analyzing climate and then how you refer back to that in your work, or if there's any connection at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm trying to think through the theories that I used having to do with positioning and identity, and certainly relevant now as we see those forces become more polarized and polemic in the United States. But also, I just came from Sweden for work because Stockholm is one of my Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance members. And they talked about the far right growing in numbers. So the far right now makes up 20% of the parliament in Sweden. And because of how they're coalitioning in the parliament, it also makes it more difficult to move forward on climate. And this far right really got fuel, unsurprisingly, from the war and climate refugees escaping the Middle East. And so as we think about how our theories from the classroom are going to be relevant in the climate space, I mean, they are just right there for the taking in terms of understanding what's happening, what's going to continue to happen as communities from South America flood north because of climate change. That's happening, will continue to happen. But as we see the Middle East move north into parts of wider Europe and how they'll continue to respond, to get more extreme in their response and position themselves through when we should be in the middle of that conversation. So I think it's so important for us to be right in the middle of this conversation, because the resource fight will continue and we'll see a lot of displacement. We're already seeing a lot of displacement and migration from climate change. Those numbers will only continue. They're already happening internally in the United States. So for us to even have like a hotline devoted to it, or a dispatchable unit devoted to it, just to mitigate the escalation of conflict in real time, is going to be a real need. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth for the Carter School because the lift is going to be so big going forward, and our theories are going to be played out right in front of our eyes, are already. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Mary Toch, and I think it's a very hard answer, in the sense that, I mean, maybe we're always playing catch up ball. The theoreticians are always seem to be caught by surprise by major historical events. We managed to not predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. We didn't predict the end of apartheid. We didn't predict the polarization that's going on now in the Western world. But you're starting to, and you have theories that were developed to deal with different kinds of conflicts. When I hit town, the theories were all about, basically theories were being dictated by the interests of people like John Burton and others in decolonization and the kind of identity group, nationalist, ethnic ethno-nationalist, especially conflicts, identity-based conflicts that were being spawned by decolonization. Now that we have now a conflict like conflicts being produced by climate change, and climate change is a global activity intimately related to the way the world does business. So it's a systemically generated conflict, if you want to look at it that way, or a systemically generated problem that causes conflicts. And I think that then, if we're being honest, we have to say we've got to play more catch-up ball. That is to say, we have to develop and do it fast, use some available theories, as Michael says, but also to develop new ideas that help us answer questions that at the moment are hard to even to ask. Because Michael mentions conflict avoidance, and in our field we're plenty conflict avoiding. It's an occupational disease, and so if you want to ask the question, well, how much do we have to change the way we do kind of normal business in order to get hold of the climate problem and actually do something about it? And people say, "Oh, don't even ask that." I mean, you know what I mean? It's a scary question. It's a scary question. How much? It's like questions that are being asked now about individual rights and authoritarian practices. How much collectivism do you need to solve a collective problem? And how can you do that and not become some kind of monstrosity? You know what I mean? So they're wonderfully interesting questions. They desperately need to be answered, and I'm way too old to answer them.
I just thought of one more thing, if I may, because Mary Jo, it's a really interesting question. And I just thought of another theory that made its way into my dissertation around structuration. And I think it's relevant to climate change, because in the climate space, there is a debate as to whether or not it's systems change or behavior change that we need. And I see a lot of climate leaders poo-pooing, dismissing behavior change because they give primacy to systems change. And I push back on them on Twitter. I told you I bring my bat in a nonviolent way, the nonviolent bat. But I push back because it is both and we need both behavior change and systems change. But there is a real heated debate because people want to feel good about their life. They don't want to feel guilty about their life choices. And so there's a pushback to this idea that you're at fault. And I am not keen to make people feel guilty. That's not mobilizing. That's not incentivizing. So that's not it. But we do need to push for both systems change and behavior change. And so structuration theory did make it into my dissertation for that reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, well, anybody else like to get in? Because we could just keep going like this for a long time.
Good questions.
Anybody have a comment or question they'd like to make?
Mary and then Kristen?
Oh, yeah, good.
Looks like, yeah.
Right.
Hey, Michael.
Hi.
New Ages. Hello.
Nice to see you. Hello.
It's
great to see you.
Well, good to see you too. I'm very happy to. When I saw your name there, I'm like, oh, I want to know what's Michael.
Wow, old reunion. I love it.
And I'm very glad I'm here, and thank you so much for doing this. Well, I was listening to you, Mike. I remember a couple of conversations that we had back in the day, and also what's happening today with me in terms of my work. I have, I am primarily a practitioner now, and but always with that reflective practice thing in the back of my mind. And how do we contribute to the conversation? To what Rich was saying about new models and new ways and new concepts that we need to keep bringing to the field. And saying that, I have found lately that one of our biggest obstacles, which sounds a little crazy, to the work that we do is the idea of hope. Keeping up the idea of hope with people that we do practice in. I mean, I do practice in the middle of a conflict that was supposed to be negotiated, and the whole thing is still a new cycle of violence. And the whole climate thing it's a structural thing that is huge, and because it's systemic, the part in which we as practitioners and as conflict resolution and peace studies people, keep hope and work with that, with the people that we work with our students, with everybody else, because that lately has been such a big thing for me. So I know you're a hopeful guy, so there you go.
Well,
I'm good to see you.
it's so great to see you. And thanks for this good question, because I've heard some climate leaders talk about the difference between optimism and hope, or I forget how they distinguish two different terms, and I think it was helpful. I want to pivot off of what I just said to Mary Jo about structuration with one quick anecdote from my own life. So as Rich noted, I used to work in Congress, worked in Congress for a while, and then got tired of that because it felt like we were doing the same policy play over and over and over again without the wins that we wanted. And so it felt like I was just spinning my wheel and not learning a lot. So I left. Spent some time at the UN with the Sustainable Development Goals. I worked with an organization that Jeff Sachs started with Ban Ki-moon called the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, because I wanted to do work at the UN. I wanted to help roll out the SDGs. And I also worked on the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I thought, okay, maybe the UN is where I need to work. Now I work with cities for a couple reasons that relate to both my conversation with you, Mary Jo, and then this point you're raising, Mary, about hope, which is, I think the work that is most fruitful in my mind right now is at the local level between communities and their electeds, because they know each other. There's a relationship, often, not always, but often, much more so than the federal or the international level. So at the UN, forget about it. Federally, maybe, but doubtful. And then at the city level, you've got a relationship. So the structuration theory is really relevant there in terms of this co-creation of new design models, sustainability that works for everyone. But then on the hope front, that's where I find, and I think our cities find, the most positive feedback that keeps them going, but it does require that they get out of the office. And so in my work with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, I am encouraging a lot of community engagement that hasn't been the precedent in a lot of cities, because there was a reliance on creating a law or a code or an ordinance or zoning, and that would be what the community would adhere to, versus this idea that we have to co-create and crowdsource and be in the community and listen to the community and create with the community. So some of you may know David Cooper-Ryder, who has worked on appreciative inquiry at Case Western, and he used that with the city of Cleveland, and I was part of that process. So I got to witness his build out with the city of Cleveland in appreciative inquiry with all stakeholders at the table, like museums and hospitals and high schools and parks and NGOs, I mean, and the city too, but funders at the table, like everyone at the table. And of course it's time intensive and it's human resource rich in terms of putting something like that on. But where the inspiration comes is that you're creating with your community, and that I find very fulfilling. And that was not there for me at the UN level or even in Congress. And so I think the more we can, and this goes to your point, Jim, and the engagement that you're calling for in your book and what you want to do post-book, and congrats on the book, the more we can engage. I was just on the phone yesterday with RMI, Rocky Mountain Institutes, and they're growing fast. That's Bezos has put some money behind them. They're growing fast. They're talking about in purple states, creating spaces for engagement, relationship building. And so we're thinking through a process there that makes sure people are talking to each other, just really basic stuff. Builders and labor and folks who may have an acrimonious relationship currently. So I have, every time I go to any of my cities and do work with the community or with city staff, I come back like high as a kite, and Sweden was no exception. Because I'm engaging with people and we're interacting with people. And so right now, post-COVID, with Zoom still kind of lingering, the need and the emphasis on like engagement with communities, co-creating together, where everyone is having a stake in the co-creation of their future is so essential in my mind, because people are alienated, they're done, they're pissed off, they don't trust electeds. In progressive cities like Amsterdam, where you would think Amsterdam would have no problem rolling out a wind energy agenda, the community pushed back against that because they weren't involved in the co-creation process. So I think for policymakers, but this is where we come in as conflict practitioners, anything we can do to help policymakers realize the benefits of creating something together in not only creating a better product long term, but also reinvigorating hope or optimism or energy or positive fill in the blank in a future that is livable and sustainable. So that work takes long, and people in the climate space are like, we have to move fast and furiously to decarbonize by 2030, and that takes time. And I was like, yeah, but what you've been trying hasn't worked. So we have to do something differently. So in the climate space, there's a big question right now about theory of change and how we do the needed work over the next decade or two. So I appreciate you raising that.
Oh, that's great, Michael. So, and then we had Kristen. Kristen, you may have the last word, or nearly the last word.
The last word, what an honor. I have what may be kind of a basic question or a general question, but and maybe your perspective on this may be different, because you did mention that you were working full time and already well into your career as you were getting your doctoral degree, but I have to answer because you mentioned kind of the social science insecurity, which I kind of I carry around like a burden over my shoulder.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, because sometimes there's a bit of a lack of understanding or maybe a lack of awareness of our field and the disciplines that kind of make up our field and the theories that underlie the work that we do. I'm curious how, just kind of generally speaking, you characterize your Carter School and conflict resolution experience when you're working with people who are unfamiliar with our discipline.
Great
How
question.
do you explain the work that we do and really kind of demonstrate its value outside of our bubble where we all share the same?
That's a great question, Kristen. And let me just address something that came up with the first part of your question that reminded me, because I did do my PhD later. I mean, in my early 30s. And I think students are being pushed to get their undergrad, master's, and sometimes PhD early in their 20s. And I think that's unfortunate that they're being encouraged in that direction, because I think that iterative process, which is like you get some schooling, then you go out in the world and do some work and apply it, and then you get some more schooling because you want some more schooling, and then you go out in the world and apply it and you test it and you problem solve it, and then maybe some more schooling. So I think for me, undergrad, a bunch of years of work, grad, a bunch of years of work, PhD, a bunch of years of work was ideal. Of course, that's my experience, so I'm speaking with bias, but as I teach, when students are like, oh, I got to get my PhD, I'm like, no, you don't. Like, you're in your mid-20s. Like, relax, go do some work, go live life, test it. But to your point, in terms of how I describe myself, so in Sweden, I prefaced, for the purpose of showing influence and impact and credibility, I did preface some of my behavior change work in behavioral science. I did refer to myself as, felt a little weird because it felt like I was grandstanding or being kind of too self-aggrandizing. But I talked about being a social scientist and having studied, which I have, I mean, not in depth, like not years and years and years of behavioral economics and behavioral science, but enough to say it, I think, with some credibility. And I did it for the purpose of laying a groundwork. If you look at TED Talks and the most successful TED Talks, 65% of the most successful TED Talks are story. But yes, they have some facts, and yes, they have some credibility, because that's important, because people aren't going to listen to your story if you haven't established that you're a credible actor in the space, and there's some facts to back it up. And so when I do my workshops or talk, that's what I tend to say. I talk because in like Sweden, as I'm thinking about translation, sociology, social science, behavioral science, I'm cognizant of the fact that that will probably translate more quickly. And I generally don't lead with like peace and conflict field, because the peace and conflict studies of the 70s and 80s and 90s comes with a certain, comes with some baggage, frankly. And so I don't introduce myself that way. I'm clearly loud and proud about this work. And what I love about this shirt, I get people coming up to me who are clearly of all stripes, like politically, Republican and Democrat. I mean, that's prejudging, but I can prejudge, because they'll come up and be like, I love your shirt. Like, everyone loves this stuff. And so given how violent our society is quickly becoming, I am just billboarding this all the time. So there might be some contradictions in there, because I'm clearly like Mr. Peace and Justice Mennonite kid, and professionally, when I do my work, I try to talk about social science and sociology. So it's a great question.
Christian, did you want to have a further word?
No, I think you answered my question. I think sometimes when I lead with peace, as you know, just characterizing the work that I do, I think it's just surprising how unscientific that's perceived. People still think we're sitting around singing "Kumbaya," and we only do that like once or twice a week. I mean, that's it, like half.
That's why I was so drawn to the Global Peace Index and the US Peace Index that the Institute for Economics and Peace was producing, because Steve Killalay, who spent some time at the Carter School, was really keen to put some numbers behind it, quantitative accounting of what makes for more peaceful societies. So I'm keen to this sounds bad, but like harden, build out the foundation of credibility for the field. And so that's why I love teaching the students, because hopefully I'm helping them sell their wares in ways that people take seriously.
See, my perspective, I want to trick people into peace. I don't want to lead with peace. I want to follow with peace.
I support that. No, it's a great question.
Right. So, it reminds me of the early days, really, at what started out as the Center for Conflict Resolution at George Mason. When I first turned up in the mid '80s, John Burton was my mentor at that point. And very shortly after that, Jim Lowy came too and was another mentor. But John said, I asked John, what is this field about? Because John didn't even want to use the word peace, and he said, this field is about solving problems, but it's about convincing people. It's about convincing people that the conflicts that are most bothersome and most difficult to resolve most of them are not the result of someone's bad character or of some misunderstanding. They're the result of some unsolved problem, which has trapped the conflict parties in its web. And if they can only see that the problem is not the other guy, the other party, that the problem is something that then they have a joint interest in solving that problem. So the problem is once that gets realized, conflict resolution starts to happen almost automatically because of that shift in thinking. Then Jim Lowy turned up, and Jim Lowy, when I hear you, Michael, I hear you really channeling Jim Lowy in many ways, especially with your emphasis on co-creation and on local action and local partnerships, with your emphasis on the behavioral side of things, on changing behavior and not just trying to change systems alone. The old yogi and the commissar problem, Arthur Kessler's problem, the yogi and the commissar. I think it makes me think the field is still alive. And that the haunting doubt that we used to have in those days is this just a fad? Are we participating in some kind of fad? And in a few years, people have gone on to something else? No, unfortunately, business is good, as far as conflict.
Unfortunately, business is good. That's right.
And so anyway.
Well, and Rich, in terms of the field being alive, let me just take a moment to thank you for inspiring me as a student, and our friendship since has been so inspiring. So you've kept that field alive, and you've created inspiration and life and fire in me and many other students who have come out of Carter School. So I just want to recognize and hold up the mirror to your role in keeping the field alive. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate that. And we appreciate everybody's participation today. So thank you.
Great to see everyone.
Thank you for coming, Michael. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for the great questions. Great to see everyone.
You bet. It has been great. So everybody take care, stay well, and we'll see you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
See you.